shore every weekend. I love the sun and I love the sand, but you can bet I won't be heading down the shore without some sunscreen. So, are you ready to protect your skin this summer? Joining us this morning, Dr. Stephen Hess, the owner and president of medical director of Center City Dermatology. Thank you so much for joining us this morning, Dr. Hess.
Thank you, Monica. It's my pleasure to be here.
All right, there are a ton of sunscreens on store shelves. We've all passed that one shelf and it just has sunscreen after sunscreen. But instead of just picking out a random bottle and putting it on, what should we really be looking for?
Well, there's a number of things that you really should be looking for when you're choosing a sunscreen. I think the most important thing to choose is a sunscreen that has an SPF of 30 or higher. That's the most important thing. You also want to look for a sunscreen that says broad spectrum, and that means that the sunscreen blocks both ultraviolet B, UVB, and ultraviolet A, UVA rays. If you're going to be spending time outdoors at the beach, for example, you want to make sure also that your sunscreen is water resistant. There's no such thing as a waterproof sunscreen, but you should look for a sunscreen that says water resistant, and many of those sunscreens are labeled sport. So that's what you'd want to use if you're going to be outdoors this summer enjoying the sun.
Okay, so look for something like a sport. And what is the difference between the various SPF levels? I mean, you said 30, but then you get to like 50 and 70. What are the differences?
Well, SPF is actually a measure of how well the sunscreen protects against ultraviolet B rays. It basically measures the ability of a sunscreen to protect against sunburn. So the American Academy of Dermatology recommends using a sunscreen with at least an SPF of 30, and that will block 97% of the ultraviolet B rays. It is true that sunscreens with higher SPF, for example, SPF 50, block more of the UVB rays, but for most people, as long as they use enough sunscreen, an SPF of 30 should be sufficient. Now, unfortunately, people tend not to use enough sunscreen. They tend to put on about half of the amount of sunscreen that they should use. So in that case, if you're using less than you should, then it may make sense with a higher SPF. One important point I want to make, though, is that a higher SPF does not mean that the sunscreen lasts any longer on the skin. It does give you a little better protection, but still wear on the skin. And it's important to reapply whatever sunscreen you use every 2 hours or more frequently if you're sweating or in the water.
All right, good to know. And should people be using a certain type for specific needs?
As I mentioned, for outdoor use, I do recommend a water-resistant sunscreen. Sunscreens are typically labeled water-resistant, which usually gives you 40 minutes of protection, or very water-resistant, which would give you 80 minutes of protection. So those are what I recommend for outdoor activities, exercising, the beach, things like that. For daily use, um, sunscreens with an SPF of 30 to have that water resistance. So if you're just putting sunscreen on to go about your day and you may be outside for a few minutes, there are other sunscreens specifically designed for the face. Many makeup products have an SPF in there. And it's also important to remember to protect your lips. So they do make lip balms with an SPF in there as well. So that's important for that indication to protect your lips.
I am always using lip balm. I hate when my lips get burned. They taste like hot dogs the rest of the day. All right, let's quickly put on the screen overview of the tips you provided us. Sunscreen tips, like you were saying, SPF of 30 or greater. All right, and then the next one, broad spectrum sunscreen, like you said, face specific sunscreen. Okay, there's that. And then use sport or water resistant SPF and avoid peak hours. Can you talk a little bit more about that, Dr. Hess?
Absolutely. The peak hours of UV exposure are between 10 a.m. and 2 p.m. So those are the times that you're going to get the most exposure to the sun. And those are the times of day that you would want to avoid being out or wear protective clothing, seek shade during those hours. Certainly, it's possible to get a sunburn or sun damage before 10 a.m. or after 2 p.m., but those are the peak hours that you need to be really careful. It's also important to make sure to wear sunscreen even on cloudy or overcast days. In my practice, one of the reasons my patients tell me that they get sunburn is they forget to put on their sunscreen on a cloudy or overcast day. But those ultraviolet rays from the sun can penetrate through the clouds, and you can get a bad sunburn even on a cloudy day.
And that's not how you want to start off your summer with a bad sunburn. Thank you, Dr. Hess, for joining us this morning.